Hi everybody, welcome back to AP Psychology with me, Miss Baines, your teacher, where you, my students, can take advantage of being able to pause and rewind me as I deliver you our latest content. So go ahead and grab those multicolored markers, get yourself nice and comfy, and of course don't forget those ever important binder notes that go in lockstep order with this video on pages 1 and 2 called Unit 6, Video 1, Part 1, Introduction to Human Development. I'll see you on the other side. Okie dokie, so as we take a look at our learning targets, today's video is a general look at human development, in which we are going to actually be talking about two parts. First, there's this video. And for it, we will talk about how it is all about the DNA, right? All about the genetics that influences our behavior. And then in part 2, you'll watch after this, the next video, which is all about how our environment influences our behavior. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started with the great debate in psychology. See there at the top of your notes on the first page, there's a sort of Venn diagram chart thing, kind of termed the great fate, or one of the conundrums in psychology, where psychologists debating forever, and anybody who is philosophical even, or a deep thinker, or just anybody who's ever even considered who they are and where they come from, right? This debate, of course, is the nature versus nurture controversy. So let's kind of briefly talk about what those two sides have in common, okay? So both impact behavior in a way that makes it difficult to know which one is responsible for any particular behavior or personality trait, right? So a more obvious one would be, I have brown eyes, right? Let's say, because my birth mother gave me the dominant gene for brown eyes, okay? She also has dark brown hair, the same as mine, along with lots of other traits that I got because of hers and my birth father's genes. These are all kind of obvious ones, okay? But what about our inner selves? Your attitudes, your disposition, or your outside assertiveness and attentiveness? Or how about how some of A or type B personality traits, or your shyness, right? Like, where did that stuff come from? And what about religious beliefs? And what about work ethic? Where do those things come from? According to Judaism, I believe, and Islam religions, I believe, it's all about the maternal bloodline. You have to be born Jewish or born Muslim to be a true Jewish or Muslim person. And it's all through the mother's bloodline. Whereas in the Christian faith, anyone can either be born into Christianity or you can join afterwards, right? You just have to accept Jesus Christ into your heart, and some say even accept him as your savior, and that certainly seems to be a spiritually inclined and therefore internal trait, or is it? Food for thought. Anyway, for some, it comes to what have been environmental choices after a lifetime of bad decisions. You don't need to be born from Christian parents to be a real Christian. It's all pretty interesting and fascinating. So then, the differences between nature and nurture is that nature is strictly DNA. I don't even like to say that nature is what you are born with, or nature is what comes from the womb, because even inside the womb, nurture has an impact there, right? Depending on the life choices of the pregnant woman at the time, right? The life choices that the pregnant mother makes and her consumption of outside influences like, say, drugs or nicotine or alcohol, right? They can certainly impact the fetus. But mostly nurture is those things that are like schooling and how your parents raised you. And if it's not your parents who raised you, then whomever did raise you, right? Let's just say your biological mother died at childbirth, right? That child would have a whole different upbringing than the birth mother would have intended for the baby. So how you're raised is super important, but it's so much more than that too, right? Anyway, we're going to first We are going to talk about that nurture side of things, the environmental side on the debate, much more in part 2 of this video, and for those notes. Okay, so for these, I'm going to talk evolutionary approach. Evolutionary psychology is a school of psychology that we really applies to the theory of evolution to our behavior. Not so much in our appearance traits or how the genes show up in what a human species looks like, okay? But instead, psychology and how the similarities arise from our biological similarities and our beliefs that all human motivation derives from the very human, as in all mammals, the very human desire to spread our gene pool. And so in doing so, it's pretty obvious that it's also important to discuss gender differences and kind of like what this looks like in the gender differences when it comes to populating the earth with other human beings. Evolutionists believe that men are more likely to be biologically attracted to younger women, whereas women more likely to be biologically attracted to older men, right? More mature men, okay? And these biological differences exist because of those differences. So that what each gender means to do in order to best spread their gene pool, right? Remember, evolutionists believe that every single behavior that anybody has comes from the desire to spread his or their gene pool. So men are going to look for a younger partner, right? A younger, more fertile woman. Because that is all they need, right? Like, it doesn't take much for a man to spread his gene pool everywhere, right? To spill his seed, if you will, and reproduce far and wide, right? Whereas for a woman, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more to it. And that's just pure biology, okay? So women, in order to do right by their and much fewer numbered eggs than the men's billions of sperm, they're going to have to pay attention, right? They're going to want to find a mate that is more protective, more settled, one who is older, one who is wiser, one who is ready to settle down and are done sowing their wild oats, as they say. They are more ready to protect and more mature to settle down and couple for life. They are ready to and more likely to have what's called the stay factor, right? Her offspring are more likely to be successful if she has someone and they are helping to build their nest, right? Helping to build the family home. I think I have mentioned this. The word husband comes from Hausband. The German word for house is Haus. And band, right? The band that goes around the house or the children or the wife to protect them from and keep them from outside dangers. And I'm guessing that this might go as far back as even with the primitive caveman times. Okay, so moving on. Overall, evolutionary psychologists say that nature selects behavioral tendencies that increase the likelihood of sending one's genes forward. Then we have another branch of psychology that looks at behavior genetics. Okay, with behavior genetics, another perspective or kind of way of looking at this is the approach wherein the study of the relative power and the limits of genetic and environmental influences have on behavior. So how these two come together, okay? You need to know the difference between those two influences. So they say the studies on identical twins who were separated at birth, identical twins who were raised together, and adoptive children who were raised outside of their birth parents' homes give us the most information. Let's talk about twin studies first. We have to first make sure we know the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins, okay? Note that identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg and are genetically clones. They are genetically identical, and that would be called the monozygotic egg, right? They teach you this in biology or living environment in 9th grade, right? So for identical twins, one egg splits, right? And they share a placenta because they are coming from the same egg. Whereas for fraternal twins, they develop from two separate eggs, and they are released in a woman's cycle as two separate eggs, and two separate sperm fertilize each of them, and they develop into two separate placentas. Fraternal twins are no more genetically alike than two separate ordinary siblings that even are born years apart. They just happen to be in the same room at the same time, two separate placentas. Now, research studies have found identical twins are much more similar to one another than fraternal twins in many ways, like their abilities, their IQs, their personality, and their interests, and so on. So this guy here at the University of Minnesota, with his Minnesota Twin Studies, did a ton of research. His name is Thomas Buchert, and he began in 1979, where he focused on 100 sets of identical twins that were reared apart. Okay? Identical twins meaning identical twins raised apart. They were separated at birth for whatever reason, and his research is still ongoing, as many of these twins are still being studied. Over 100 pairs of identical twins were separated at birth. He reported that heredity, what they have in common because of the DNA-wise, can be accounted for in 64 to 74% of the differences in their IQs. So intelligence is very much due to genetics, to their DNA, with identical twins. There's a case study kind of showing this research on how it all played out, right? So two similar identical twins and it's a very interesting story to consider, which I believe I mentioned in the other video in the last unit. A pair of separated identical twins named Gary Levy and Mark Newman, who were separated at birth, and so when they finally met, they were adults and they were all grown up, and they both had so many things in common. They both had the same mustache and sideburns. They both wore the same glasses with the same prescription. Both of them married women named Betty, and then I think women named Linda the second time, and now both are decidedly staunch bachelors. Both had similar careers. One had a degree in forestry, and the other had a job cutting down trees. One installed sprinkler systems, and one installed fire alarms. Wow. Both are volunteer firefighters as well. Both of them have favorite things to do that are to hunt and fish, and both love to watch John Wayne movies and order in Chinese and eat Chinese food. Wait, there's more. Both only drink Budweiser beer, and both hold the can in what they call only ethical way to hold a Budweiser can. And both carry their car keys in the same exact manner. Wild, right? So it is very interesting, and it shows you how powerful genetics are and how they can even cross over in things that might be called environmental, right? Environmental options. Identical twins have so much in common, as these two definitely do. So when they were separated, the twins, you can see that their genes are exactly the same. So any differences there had to be based on environmental causes. They had to be due to the two different upbringings or environments that they were raised in, not their genes. Pretty crazy. What this guy's studies have found is that genetic influence on general intelligence ranges from 50 to 70% and slightly less on personality and interests. Study says, however, that identical twins raised together will have similar IQs about 86% of the time, while those raised apart will only show a slightly less equivalence at about 73%. Okay? Next up is the environment, or adoption studies. Adoption studies show how influential our rearing is. That is, how our environment, our friends, our peer group, our schooling, our socioeconomic stratification, our religion, our mores, how much of this has to do with who we are. So the study showed that children who are raised apart, who are adopted, are more similar in ways to their biological parents than they are to their adoptive parents. However, their adoptive parents do influence the adoptee's attitudes, values, manners, faith, and politics. Furthermore, adoptive children tend to score higher on achievement or intelligence tests than their biological parents did, as well as they tend to be more self-giving and altruistic than their non-adopted counterparts. That's kind of interesting, right? Especially when we consider why a child might be given up for adoption to begin with, right? And how the birth mother may have wanted for that child to have a better life than she could give them. So the life she wanted her child to have would be completely different. I've always found that such a selfless act, even being an adoptee myself. Okay, so the biggest thing I want you to take away from the adoption studies are to think about what do adoption studies show us in terms of having influence on, well, adoption studies show us what is culturally or environmentally determined, and that those are the things that you can choose for yourself what you're going to be like, right? Your disposition or your outgoingness. There's very little evidence that that comes from DNA. You're born with things like your attitudes or your values or your manners or your faith or your politics. Evidence point that those things are entirely influenced by your adoptive parents or by your environment and your peer groups. Heritability, okay? Heritability is up next. Let's get down with heritability, called the big bad H word in psychology. And the reason we call this the big bad H word is because students get a little freaked out by it, and rightfully so. I certainly was at first, but I want you to get up out of your thoughts and don't make it overly complicated. I want you to think about this as simply as possible, okay? So first I want you to write down ability is simply the differences due to DNA. So what we inherit from our genetics, right? That's not how we are similar, it's how we are different. That's not what heritability is. Heritability wants to see or is looking for how people are different because of their genetics. Right? So identical twins are going to have duplicate genes, right? They're identical, so their heritability is 0. The extent to which they are different is entirely up to whatever the way they were raised in a particular household, or through their peer groups, or through their environment. So what you can see in a trait is due to the difference in genes and therefore is not due to their environment, okay? So the more inherited a trait is, the less heritable that it is. Again, heritability looks at how traits are due to the differences in one's genes, whereas inheritance or heredity, heredity, looks at how they are similar. And that I get my, whatever, brown colored eyes from my birth mom and my birth dad, right? Heredity, right? That's because inheritance, because you have the genes in common. So that is not heritability. It's a 0 heritability. Here's an example from the twin studies. Identical twins have a 0 or very low heritability because they are like clones. They have exactly the same DNA. Any differences between them have to come from their environment. Now, how about the number that shows heritability? Heritability because the variation in their behavior cannot be accounted for by genetic differences, and that is because they are clones. Carbon copies of one another, basically clones of each other genetically, right? They do not have different genes, therefore any differences between them is not going to be due to genetics, DNA. Therefore, their heritability is low number, or 0. Now, the difference between, let's say, my personality and your personality is going to be a high number, right? Because we don't have any genetics in common. We are completely different genetically, right? And so that any difference between us is 100% or highly heritable because it can't be our genetics. It has to be from our environment. Again, different personalities between us, between you and me, is not genetic, and therefore it's got to have a high heritability number. But there's another thing. Since you all live near me, or in the same region, say, or the same city, let's say, New York City, our differences become more heritable, right? Because our environment is similar, and because our things that we do with our interactions in our environment are similar, I want you to make a note of this, are even more certain that our differences are due to genetic differences. If our environment is the same, right? So you should make a note that if in an experiment, if there's a question about environments becoming more similar, heritability increases because you're controlling for the environment, knowing that genes have to cause any differences in a given population of people. Okay, well, hopefully that was clear, and if not, there is a study.com video coming up afterwards to help you, which I will either show you now or tomorrow in class. So I hope you found that helpful, and that's all for now. Bye now.